Hey there, and welcome to True Scary Stories. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That helps YouTube know you love creepy stories, and it'll keep sending more your way.
9 true scary North Dakota tribal police horror stories. Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back. If you're new here, glad you found us, and fair warning, what you're about to hear is going to stay with you for a while. Tonight, I have 9 stories for you. All of them come from North Dakota, specifically from the tribal lands and the communities around them. These are accounts shared by people who lived them, who worked the roads and the reservations in the wide open dark of the northern plains. Tribal police officers, ranchers, dispatches, ordinary people who had experiences they couldn't explain and haven't forgotten. North Dakota is a place that doesn't get talked about much in popular culture, but anyone who has spent real time there knows it carries something in it. The land is old. The wind never stops. At night, out away from any city light, it gets dark in a way that cities never do. Total, pressing, complete. And things happen in that kind of dark that people don't always talk about out loud. I want to be respectful in the way I tell these stories. The tribal communities of North Dakota have rich traditions, deep histories, and their own understanding of the world that extends well beyond what most outsiders ever hear about. What these storytellers have shared, they've shared voluntarily, with the intention of being heard. I'm passing their words along as faithfully as I can. 9 stories, all true as far as the people who told them are concerned. Let's get into it. Story 1. The Thing on Route 8. Before I get into this, I want you to know that the person who shared this with me is a retired tribal police officer. He served on the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe's tribal police force for over 20 years. He's not someone who scares easily. He's seen car wrecks, domestic violence calls, things that would shake most people to the bone. But this is the one thing he says he still thinks about when the lights go out. It was November, mid-November, which in North Dakota means the temperature drops to single digits and the wind comes across the plains like something alive. There's no trees to break it up out there, just flat open land stretching in every direction, and that sky, wide and dark and loaded with stars, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. His name was Dale Weston. He'd been doing night patrols on the reservation for about 4 years at this point. He knew every road, every back trail, every farmhouse and trailer and broken down fence post out there. He told me Route 8 was one of those roads that cut right across the heart of the reservation, used by locals mostly, not a lot of traffic after 10 at night. That night he was out around 2 in the morning. No radio calls, nothing going on. Just him and the dark and the heater humming in his cruiser. He was coming up a long straight stretch of Route 8 when his headlights caught something on the road about 300 feet ahead. At first he thought it was a deer. You get a lot of deer out there, especially at night. But as he slowed the cruiser down, he realized the shape was wrong. It was too tall, way too tall to be a deer, and it was standing upright. He cut his speed and let the headlights wash over it. He said it looked like a person, roughly the right shape, but something about the way it was standing made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was just slightly too still, like it wasn't breathing, like it had been carved from the darkness and placed on that road specifically for him to find. Dale stopped the cruiser about 40 feet away. He turned on his spotlight and angled it toward the figure. What he saw made him put his hand on his weapon without even thinking about it. It was tall. He estimated close to 7 feet, dressed in what looked like dark, ragged clothing, or maybe that wasn't clothing at all. Maybe that was skin. He couldn't tell. The figure's arms hung down past where they should have, too long. He said if you took a normal person and somehow stretched the arms down to mid-thigh level, that's what it looked like. And the head was turned toward him, not the body, just the head, rotated almost 90 degrees to the side so that it was looking directly at him, even though the rest of the body was facing away. Dale said he sat there for maybe 15 seconds, and in those 15 seconds he felt something he had never felt before on the job. He said it wasn't just fear, it was a feeling like something was wrong with the world, like the laws of how things were supposed to work had just quietly stopped applying. Then the figure moved. It didn't walk, it didn't run, it sort of folded. That's the only word he can find for it. It folded down toward the ditch on the side of the road and disappeared into the darkness between one blink and the next. Gone. The road was empty. Dale sat there with his hand still on his weapon for a full minute before he radioed in. He kept his voice flat and professional. He said he thought he may have spotted a person in distress on Route 8, and could someone do a wellness check in the area. He didn't say what he actually saw. The backup unit drove that stretch twice. Nothing. No footprints in the frost on the shoulder, no signs anyone had been there at all. Dale told me he drove back over that spot the next morning in daylight. He stopped and got out and walked the ditch. The ground was frozen and hard. And then he found something. About 20 feet into the dry grass off the shoulder, he found a patch of flattened vegetation in a rough circle, maybe 4 feet across, like something very large and very heavy had sat down in it or crouched. He never found an explanation. He never told his supervisors the full story, and he never drove that stretch of Route 8 after dark.
Story 2. The Knock at Grandma Loretta's. This one comes from a woman named Carla. She grew up in Bismarck, but her grandmother, her mom's mom, lived on the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Reservation up in the northern part of the state. Every summer as a kid, Carla would spend a few weeks up there. She loved it. She loved her grandma's cooking, loved the land, loved the stories her grandmother would tell in the evenings. But there was one rule her grandmother had always had. One rule that was never explained, never justified, never debated. And that rule was this: you do not answer the door after midnight. Carla had always assumed it was just an old woman's quirk, something rooted in whatever superstitions her grandmother had grown up with. She figured by the time she was 17, she was old enough to sort out for herself what was real and what wasn't. That summer, the summer she was 17, she was staying with her grandmother for 2 weeks in July. The house was a small, single-story place set back from the road with a gravel driveway and a big cottonwood tree in the front yard. Nice house, comfortable. Her grandmother kept it immaculate. On the third night she was there, Carla woke up at around 1 in the morning. She wasn't sure what woke her. Maybe a sound, maybe nothing. She lay in the dark for a moment, and then she heard it. A knock at the front door. 3 knocks. Even, measured, deliberate. Like whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. Carla got up. She was halfway down the hall when her grandmother appeared in the doorway of the master bedroom. She was already awake. She was already standing, and the look on her face stopped Carla cold. Her grandmother looked at her and said very quietly, "Go back to your room and close the door." Carla said, "Grandma, someone's at the door." Her grandmother said, "I know. Go back to your room." Carla stood there, trying to process this, when there were 3 more knocks. Same rhythm, same patience. Her grandmother walked to the front door, but she didn't open it. She pressed her back against the wall beside the door frame, and she said in a firm, clear voice, "This is not a house that opens after dark. You go on now." There was a pause, and then a voice came from the other side of the door. Carla described the voice to me, and she struggled to put it into words. She said it sounded like a person doing an impression of a person, like someone who had heard what human speech was supposed to sound like, but had never quite gotten it right. The voice said, and these were the exact words, "I just need to come inside for a little while." Her grandmother said again, louder this time, "You go on. You are not welcome here." Another pause, then 3 more knocks, and then nothing. Total silence. Her grandmother stood with her back against that wall for almost 5 full minutes without moving. Then she went to the window and looked out. Then she went to the back of the house and checked the back door. Then she sat down in her kitchen chair and folded her hands on the table and didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Carla sat across from her and asked her what that was. Her grandmother said, "There are things that walk at night out here. They are not people. They sometimes look like people, or they try to. They want to come in. They need you to invite them or open the door yourself. As long as you don't, they can't come in." Carla asked her if it had happened before. Her grandmother just nodded and said, "More than once. That is why there is a rule." The next morning, Carla looked at the front step. There were no footprints in the dust on the porch, none on the gravel of the driveway either. Whatever had knocked on that door, it hadn't walked up to it, or if it had left no trace of itself behind. Just the sound of knocking, and that voice, and an old woman's hand-worn rule that Carla has never once questioned since.
Story 3. The Missing Boys of Fort Berthold. This story involves a tribal police investigator who asked that I not use his real name. I'll call him Officer Nolan. He worked for the MHA Nation, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation out of Newtown, North Dakota, on the Fort Berthold Reservation. He spent 11 years in investigations before he transferred out, and he says there is one case from his second year that he never officially closed and never fully recovered from either. He told me he still keeps the case folder, not at work, at home in a box under his bed. He says he doesn't know why he keeps it there. He just can't make himself throw it away. In the spring of that year, 2 teenage boys went missing from the reservation. They were cousins, 15 and 16 years old. Both were well known in the community. The older one, the 16-year-old, was quiet, bookish, the kind of kid who carried a worn paperback in his jacket pocket wherever he went. The younger one was the opposite, loud, funny, always the center of whatever was going on. Everyone in the community knew him by his nickname. He'd had it since he was 5 years old, and it had just stuck. Their families were close. The boys had grown up practically as brothers. Neither was the type to just take off. Everyone who knew them said the same thing without being prompted. These were not boys who would disappear without a word. They'd left one afternoon to go fishing at a spot on Lake Sakakawea they'd gone to 100 times before. They took bicycles. They told the younger boy's mother they'd be back by dinner. They never came back. The bikes were found the next morning by a man driving out to check irrigation equipment. Both bikes pulled off the road and leaned against a fence post side by side. He almost drove past, thinking someone had just parked them there. He slowed because something felt wrong without him being able to say exactly what. No sign of struggle, no blood, no abandoned gear, no fishing poles, just 2 bikes, side by side, leaned up neatly like the boys had parked them there with every intention of coming back and had simply not returned. Nolan was assigned to the case as secondary investigator, working under the lead detective and coordinating with tribal authorities and the FBI, since missing persons on federal land can trigger federal involvement quickly. He told me the first week was chaos. Search parties went out every morning. Canine units worked the area around the bikes. A helicopter swept the lakeshore and the surrounding prairie. Volunteers came from neighboring communities, people who had known the boys, people who hadn't. The lake was searched by boat. Every inch of the area around those bikes was walked and photographed and walked again. Nothing. What they did find, and this is the part Nolan couldn't explain and still can't, was a trail. Not much of one, but something. About half a mile from where the bikes were, a tracker with the search team found shoe impressions in soft ground near a creek. 2 sets, headed north. The tracker, a man who had been doing search and rescue work for over 15 years, someone the department trusted completely, followed the trail carefully, marking each impression with small flags. For about a quarter mile the trail held. 2 sets of prints, consistent stride, headed north across the soft creek bank and into the grassland beyond. Then the stride pattern changed. Both sets of prints lengthened dramatically, from a normal walking pace to something that suggested the boys had broken into a full run. The tracker said it looked like they'd started sprinting, hard, fast, covering ground quickly. Whatever made them run had apparently happened without warning. There was no gradual change, no cautious lengthening of stride, just walking, then running, as suddenly as a switch being thrown. And then, about 30 feet past that point, there was just one set of prints. One, not two. The tracker stopped and went back. He checked the ground on either side. He walked a wide loop around the area looking for where the second set of prints had gone, veered off, doubled back, anything. Nothing. One set of prints just stopped appearing. The other continued another 20 feet, and then those stopped too. Like whoever had been running had simply ceased to exist. No disturbance in the grass, no marks suggesting a fall, a struggle, a vehicle. The ground just stopped receiving the weight of anyone. The tracker told Nolan he'd never seen anything like it in 15+ years. He walked that stretch 3 times, got down on his knees and studied the ground with a magnifying lens. He said the last clear impression of the second set of prints was a left shoe, pressed fairly deep. Whoever made it had been moving fast, putting serious weight down, and then nothing. He couldn't explain it. He put it in his report exactly as he'd found it and left the explanation blank. 3 weeks into the investigation, Nolan got a call from a woman who lived about 6 miles from where the bikes were found. She was elderly, lived alone on a small property her family had owned for decades. She was reluctant to call. She told Nolan she hadn't wanted to get involved, and she hadn't wanted people thinking she was the kind of person who made things up. She was very clear on that point. She was not that kind of person. She said she'd seen the boys, or something wearing the boys. She'd been sitting on her porch that evening. She often sat outside late, she said, because she had trouble sleeping and the night air settled her. She said she'd watched them walk by on the road in front of her house, just watched them pass. She'd called out hello because she thought she recognized the younger one. She knew his family. They didn't respond, didn't look up, didn't slow down. She described the way they were walking as the thing that bothered her most. Not that they ignored her, maybe they hadn't heard. What bothered her was the way they moved. They were walking in perfect single file, one directly behind the other, and they were moving in exactly the same way. Same stride length, same arm swing, same slight forward lean. She said it was like watching one person and their shadow, except the shadow was walking behind instead of beside. She said it was wrong in a way she couldn't articulate beyond that. Just wrong. Something about it made her get up and go inside and lock her door, which she hadn't done in years. Their faces were turned down toward the ground. They didn't look up once. When Nolan asked her what time this was, she said it was almost midnight, more than 6 hours after the boys were supposed to have been home, 6 hours after 2 bikes had been left leaning against a fence post 3 miles from a fishing spot they'd never reached. Nolan asked her if she'd be willing to come in and make a formal statement. She said yes. She came in the next day and she sat across from him and she repeated everything she'd told him on the phone, word for word, without changing a single detail. He said that consistency, the fact that nothing shifted in the retelling, was the thing that stayed with him. People who make things up tend to embellish the second time. She didn't change a word. He drove back out to her road that afternoon and stood where she said she'd been sitting. He looked at the stretch of road she would have been watching. He tried to find an angle, a trick of the light, a reason why 2 boys walking normally might look like what she'd described. He couldn't find one. Neither boy was ever found. The case went cold within the year. The families never stopped looking, but the investigation stalled without evidence, without leads, without anything to push it forward. Nolan said those families carried that loss the way you carry something that never stops being heavy. He thought about them for years after he transferred out. He told me he drove out to that road one evening, not for any official reason, just to see it again. He sat in his truck for a long time looking north across the open plain, watching the light change on the grass, and he thought about what that old woman had said, something wearing the boys. He said that phrase had never left him, not once in all the years since, because out of everything,
The missing bikes, the footprints that stopped mid-stride, the FBI reports, the dead ends. That one phrase from an elderly woman on a porch was the only description of anything from that entire investigation that felt, somehow, like the truth. He doesn't know what was out there that night. He doesn't claim to. But he told me that whatever it was, whatever had been walking that road in the shape of two boys with their faces turned down, it was moving somewhere with a purpose. It was moving north, and it had somewhere to be. He just hopes, and this is the exact way he said it to me, quietly, looking at the table between us. He just hopes that wherever it was going, the boys themselves weren't still inside it when it got there.
Story 4. Badlands Campsite. A man named Perry went on a solo camping trip in the Little Missouri National Grassland in western North Dakota. He'd been an outdoorsman his whole life, hunting, hiking, camping alone in remote areas. He was comfortable being in the middle of nowhere. He actually preferred it. The further from civilization, the better as far as Perry was concerned. He'd set up camp near a dry creek bed about 4 miles from the nearest road. Good spot, elevated enough to see the Badlands formations in the distance, sheltered enough to cut the wind. He'd done this kind of trip a dozen times before. He had everything he needed and he was in his element. He turned in around 10 o'clock the first night. The sky was unbelievable. No light pollution, full spread of stars, the Milky Way visible like a smear of pale smoke above him. He fell asleep quickly and slept well until around 3 in the morning when something woke him up. He lay still in his sleeping bag for a moment, listening. There was sound outside his tent. Not wind, not an animal moving through brush. Something deliberate. Footsteps. The slow, careful footsteps of something moving around the outside of his tent. Perry was experienced enough not to panic. He figured maybe a person, maybe a lost hiker or someone from a nearby camp he hadn't seen. He reached slowly for his headlamp and his hunting knife, which he kept in a sheath beside his bedroll. "Hello?" he said. The footsteps stopped. He waited. Nothing. He said hello again. Still nothing. Then the footsteps resumed, but slower this time, slower and closer. He could hear them on the dry grass just inches from the tent wall. He could see by the faint starlight that filtered through the tent fabric a shadow moving past. Perry unzipped the tent in one fast motion and came out with his headlamp on. He swept the beam around the campsite. Nothing. No one. The beam cut out across the grass in every direction, and he was alone. But the sound had been right there, right outside that tent wall. Whatever had been making it had been close enough to touch the fabric. He stayed out for 20 minutes, walking the perimeter of his campsite, checking everything. The dry ground showed no fresh impressions. His gear hadn't been touched. He finally went back inside, heart still hammering, and lay awake until morning. At first light, he broke camp and hiked back toward the road. He took a different route than he'd come in, cutting across a ridge he hadn't used before. And about 1.5 miles from his campsite, he came across something that he still has no explanation for. In a wide flat area between 2 low ridges, there was a ring of small flat stones on the ground, maybe 20 feet across. The stones weren't naturally placed. They were too uniform, too deliberate. In the center of the ring was a pile of bones, small bones mostly, bird bones, Perry thought, and maybe small mammal, but they were arranged, not scattered, arranged in a rough pattern that he couldn't quite identify, but that felt purposeful. He photographed it. He reported it to the U.S. Forest Service office when he got back to Cell Range. A ranger he spoke to was politely dismissive, probably a natural accumulation, possibly left by hikers, nothing to worry about. But Perry told me that the direction from the ring to his campsite was dead straight. He checked with his compass. Whatever had been walking around his tent that night, it had come from that ring, and it had gone back to it.
He hasn't camped alone in the Badlands since.
Story 5. Welfare Check on Gravel Road 14. Officer Tanya Red Cloud had been with the Spirit Lake Nation's tribal police for about 3 years when this happened. She's shared this story with a handful of people over the years, and it's made its way to me through a mutual friend. She gave permission for it to be shared, but she asked that the specific location details be kept a little vague out of respect for the family involved. I'll honor that. It was a February evening. Cold, genuinely dangerous cold, the kind North Dakota gets, where exposed skin starts going numb in minutes. Tanya was on a call about a welfare check. An elderly man who lived alone on a remote stretch of gravel road hadn't been seen by neighbors in a few days. His truck was still in the driveway. Phone calls went unanswered. Standard welfare check, the kind tribal police handle regularly. She pulled up to the house just after 7 in the evening. Small house, 1 story, brown with white trim. A dog pen off to the side, empty, gate hanging open. The truck in the driveway, lights off inside. She called out from her unit before approaching, standard procedure. She knocked on the front door. Nothing. Knocked again. Then she heard something from inside, a sound she initially couldn't identify, a low, uneven sound, like someone moving slowly across a floor. "This is tribal police. I'm here to check on you. Can you come to the door?" The sound inside stopped. She waited. Then she heard it again, and this time she recognized it, or thought she did. Dragging. Something being dragged across the floor. She tried the handle. Unlocked. She pushed the door open and announced herself loudly as she entered. The house was dark and cold, nearly as cold as outside, which told her the heat had been off for a while. She used her flashlight and cleared the front room. Nothing. She moved down the hallway toward the back of the house, her hand on her weapon. The bedroom at the end of the hall is where she found the old man. He was on the floor, and he was alive, barely. Hypothermic, dehydrated, he'd had a fall and couldn't get up. She immediately radioed for medical. While she was with him, waiting for the ambulance, keeping him conscious and as warm as she could, he started talking, delirious from the cold, rambling. Most of it didn't make sense, but one thing he said she remembered clearly. He looked past her, toward the door of the bedroom, at something she couldn't see, and he said in a clear, sharp voice that didn't sound delirious at all, "Don't let it follow you out." She turned. The doorway was empty. The man recovered. He was in the hospital for several days, and when Tanya followed up with him, he had no memory of the rescue. He had no memory of the days before either. He couldn't tell her what he'd seen. But here's what Tanya couldn't explain. When she left that house that night, after the ambulance had taken the old man away and she was doing a final walkthrough before securing the property, she found the old man's dog. It was under the bed, not in the dog pen, not outside, under the bed, pressed against the wall, shaking. The dog pen was on the opposite side of the house from the bedroom window. There was no way the dog had gotten inside through a closed door on its own. The dog wouldn't come out. She had to reach under the bed and drag it out herself. And she said as she carried it to her unit, it kept looking back at the house, its eyes fixed on the window of that back bedroom. It never looked away, not until she drove out of range. Story 6. The Face in the Pasture. A rancher named Gib Halverson owned a property that bordered the edge of the Standing Rock Reservation. His family had been on that land for 3 generations. He knew it the way most people never get to know any place, intimately, seasonally, deeply. He knew where the water ran when it rained hard. He knew which fence posts had gone soft. He knew the sounds the land made at night. So when something changed, he noticed. It started in late August. His cattle, about 60 head, began refusing to go into the north pasture. He thought maybe a coyote had gotten in there, or some other predator. He walked the whole north pasture, checked the fence line, found nothing. No blood, no tracks, no carcasses, nothing that should have scared them. But the cattle wouldn't go.
He had to physically push them in with his horse, and even then they stayed bunched together in the center of the pasture, away from the fence lines, heads up and watchful. A week later, his dog, a border collie named Pip, who had worked livestock with him for 6 years and was about as steady as a dog gets, started refusing to go outside at night. Pip would go to the door, look out, and back away, every night. Gib thought the dog might be sick, but in the daylight, Pip was fine, normal, working cattle like always, only at night. Then Gib saw it himself. He'd gone out around 11 to check that the barn was latched. He had a habit of this, just a nightly routine. He came out of the barn and was walking back to the house when he saw at the far edge of the north pasture a light. Not a bright light, a dull, pale, slightly moving light, low to the ground. He thought maybe someone had driven a vehicle in off the access road that ran along the reservation boundary. He got his spotlight, the big handheld one he used for checking the herd at night, and swept it across the pasture. The light was gone, but in the beam of the spotlight at the fence line, he saw a face. That was all, just a face at fence post height, looking at him from between the wire strands. He said it looked human, but the proportions were wrong. The eyes were too far apart, and they caught the light in a way that animal eyes do, a flat, reflective shine. It wasn't blinking, it was just looking at him. He stood there for maybe 4 seconds, then the spotlight flickered, something it had never done before, and when it steadied, the face was gone. Gib called the tribal police the next morning, not because he expected them to do anything, but because the land on the other side of that fence was reservation boundary land, and he felt like someone ought to know. A young officer came out and walked the fence line with him. They found in the soft earth near one of the posts a print. Not a footprint exactly, more of an impression. The officer crouched down and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Finally, Gib asked him what he thought it was. The officer stood up and said, "I'd keep your livestock out of this pasture at night for a while, and I'd keep your outside lights on." He didn't explain further. He wrote something in his notebook, shook Gib's hand, and left. Gib sold the north pasture 2 years later. He told the buyer it was good land, good grass, water access, everything a buyer could want. He didn't mention the face at the fence. He told me that every now and then, when he's in that part of the state, he'll look over at the old north pasture as he drives by. He doesn't stop, he doesn't slow down. He just checks it from a distance and keeps moving.
This one involves the Tribal Police Dispatch Center, and it came to me from a woman who worked there as a dispatcher for several years. Her name is Donna. She loved her job and she was good at it. But she told me there was one night she came close to walking out and never coming back. It was a slow Tuesday night, late fall. Most of the officers were out on routine patrol. Call volume was low. Donna was alone in the dispatch center, doing paperwork between calls. At around 1:15 in the morning, the non-emergency line rang. She answered it the way she always did, professional, calm, identified herself and the department. There was a pause on the other end. Then a voice spoke. She said the voice was a child's voice, a young child, maybe 7 or 8 years old. It said, "I need help. Someone is outside." Donna went immediately into protocol. She asked the child their name. The child gave a name, the first name, and she said it clearly and calmly, no panic in the voice, which Donna noticed right away. Kids calling in scared speak differently. They cry, they rush, their voices break. This child spoke with an evenness that felt off. She asked for an address. The child said, "I don't know the address. It's the house by the old bridge." There was more than one old bridge on and near the reservation. Donna asked which road. The child said, "The one with the sign that fell down." She asked the child if there was an adult in the house. The child said, "No adults." She had an officer start driving toward a location she thought might match the description while she kept the child talking. She asked the child what was outside. The child said, something that looks like my dad." Donna asked what the child meant by that. There was a long pause, and then the child said, "It has his face, but it isn't him. My dad is in Bismarck." She asked the child to stay on the line. She radioed the officer to expedite, and then the child said something that made her set the phone down on the desk for a moment because her hands were shaking. The child said, "It knows I called you. It's looking at the window now and smiling. It didn't smile before." The officer reached 3 different properties near Old Bridge crossings within 20 minutes. Nothing. No child. No disturbance. All properties checked out normal. The call had come in on the non-emergency line, and Donna pulled the number. It was listed as a disconnected residential line. The phone company confirmed the number had been out of service for over 2 years. The property it was originally registered to was an abandoned house that had been condemned and vacated well before that. Donna stayed on shift, but she said she didn't touch the non-emergency phone for the rest of the night. Every time it would ring, her stomach would drop. She told me she doesn't know what to make of it. She doesn't try to explain it anymore. But she said that phrase, "It has his face," has followed her for years, because whatever that was on the other end of the line, it wasn't calling for help. She's convinced of that now. She thinks it was calling because it wanted to be found. It wanted someone to come looking. And she's very glad that it wasn't.
Story 8. Lake Sakakawea at low water. If you've never seen Lake Sakakawea, it's one of the largest man-made lakes in the United States. It sits in the middle of North Dakota, formed when the Garrison Dam was built on the Missouri River back in the 50s. When they flooded that valley, a lot of things went under the water. Towns, cemeteries, old homesteads, places that had been there for a long time. The water covers all of it. Or usually it does. In drought years, the water level drops, and when it drops far enough, things start coming back up. A man named Everett was fishing from the north shore of the lake on a hot July day when the water was particularly low. He'd gone out early before sunup to get to his spot before the wind came up. Good fisherman, been doing it his whole life. He was set up on a rocky point about 2 miles from the nearest boat ramp. Quiet morning, pre-dawn, maybe 4:30, the sky just starting to go from black to a very deep blue on the horizon. He noticed something about 50 yards out from the shore. At first, he thought it was a sandbar that he hadn't seen before. The low water was doing strange things to the shoreline, but as the light grew, he realized it wasn't a sandbar. It had angles, straight lines, corners. It was a building, just barely exposed, the roof ridge and the top foot or two of walls just breaking the surface. Old wood, dark with water, covered in silt and algae, but unmistakably a building, a submerged structure that the drought had almost, but not quite, brought back to the surface. Everett was curious. He had a small kayak with him, and he paddled out to get a closer look. He could see down through the water to where the structure continued below, what looked like a one-room building, the walls intact, a dark opening where a window might have been. He hovered there in the kayak, looking down into that dark window, and then something looked back. He described it to me, and he was careful about his words. He said he couldn't be entirely sure what he saw because the water was murky and the light was still low, but he said it looked like a face, a pale face, below the surface of the water in what would have been the window frame of the submerged building, looking up at him. He said he didn't move for a moment, just frozen, staring down, and then the face, if that's what it was, moved. Not toward him. It moved back, away from the window, into the deeper dark of the interior of the flooded interior. Everett paddled back to shore faster than he'd ever paddled anything in his life. He sat on the rocks for an hour. He told himself it was a fish, or a trick of the light, or his eyes adjusting to the dawn. He told himself all of those things. But he said when he got home and looked up old records online, he found documentation that confirmed what he'd suspected,
that the valley where Lake Sakakawea now sits had contained a small settlement that was relocated when the dam was built. The residents had been moved, but not all of them had gone willingly, and some of the older records noted that certain individuals had simply been listed as unable to locate before the flooding. Everett goes back to that lake. He still fishes it, but he never paddles out to that point anymore. And if you ask him what he saw, he'll tell you it was probably nothing. He'll tell you that with a straight face and a steady voice. But he won't look you in the eye when he says it.
Story 9. The Last Patrol. The last story I want to share with you tonight is probably the one that affected me the most when I first heard it. It comes from a tribal police officer on the Standing Rock Reservation, a veteran officer, 20-plus years on the job, a man everyone in the department respected. I'll call him Officer Crane. In his last year before retirement, Officer Crane was given a lighter schedule, mostly administrative work, mentoring new officers, desk shifts. But one night he agreed to cover a patrol for a younger officer who was sick. Just a standard overnight patrol, the same roads he'd driven hundreds of times. He figured it would be a quiet night and a good chance to say goodbye to the roads he'd spent his career on. It started out as expected. Quiet. Clear night, cold, stars bright. He drove the usual circuit, checked the usual spots, nothing out of the ordinary. Around 2:30 in the morning, he was heading back toward the station when his lights caught something on the side of the road. A person, standing still, facing the road, right at the edge of where his headlights reached. He slowed down and pulled alongside. It was a young man, maybe 20 years old, dressed lightly for the cold, jeans, a thin jacket, standing on the shoulder of the road, staring straight ahead. Crane rolled down his window and asked if he was all right. The young man turned and looked at him, and Officer Crane felt something drop through his chest, because he recognized the young man's face. He had known that face for years. It belonged to a boy from the community who had died in a car accident on this very road, 5 years ago. Crane had worked the scene. He'd written the report. He knew the face. He sat there in his cruiser, engine running, window down, looking at the face of a dead young man standing on the road in the middle of the night. He said the young man just looked at him. No expression, just looking. And then the young man lifted one hand and pointed, down the road, east, in the direction Crane had been heading. Crane told me he has driven that road 1,000 times, and he knew it as well as his own driveway. But for some reason, in that moment, he did not want to drive in the direction that young man was pointing. He felt it in his gut as clearly as he had ever felt anything. Don't go that way. Not tonight. He sat there another moment, then radioed in to let dispatch know he was heading back by the north route instead of completing his usual circuit. The dispatcher didn't question it. When he looked back, the young man was gone. The next morning, the day shift found a vehicle on that east stretch of road. It had gone off the road into a ravine. The driver, a man in his 30s, had veered off sometime in the early morning hours. He'd survived barely. The medic said if he hadn't been found when he was, it would have been a different outcome. There is no way to say for certain that the warning Crane received and the accident are connected. He doesn't claim to know what he saw that night. He's not that kind of man. But he told me that when he finally retired a few months later, he thought about that young man on the road, about the face he recognized. And he said whatever it was, whatever was standing on that road pointing east, it saved a life that night. He hopes the young man knows that, wherever he is. That's where I'll leave you tonight. 9 stories from the plains and the reservation roads and the dark edges of North Dakota. The land up there has memory. The water does too. And on certain nights, certain roads, certain doorsteps, that memory pushes up through the surface of things, the way a structure pushes up through low water, not to haunt, not always to harm, sometimes just to remind you that there is more out there than the narrow strip of light your headlights cut through the dark. Drive safe, and if something is standing on the road ahead of you tonight, maybe slow down before you get too close. All right, that's 9. 9 stories from the people and the places and the long, dark roads of North Dakota. I want to thank everyone who shared their experiences. It takes something to talk about these things, and I don't take that lightly. If you have your own story, something that happened to you in a place that not many people talk about, somewhere remote and quiet and strange, I do read submissions. The link is in the description. If you made it this far, do me a favor and leave a comment. Let me know which story got to you the most. And if you're watching this late at night, maybe check that your doors are locked before you close this video. I'll see you in the next one.